My name is Grace Nosek, and I graduated from UBC with a PhD working in climate justice, and I was a student organizer while I was there as well. And in both of those capacities, I had the incredible privilege to work with the two humans I'm about to introduce. And they are an absolute delight. I feel so lucky that we're going to get to hear from them for the next little hour. Gladwin, Associate Professor of Language and Literacy Education, and Naoko Ellis, Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering, are a collaborative team at the University of British Columbia. They complement their diverse disciplinary backgrounds within the nexus of climate and sustainability education, blending the socio-cultural with technical approaches to provide holistic systems perspectives. They co-lead a transdisciplinary collaborative PhD cohort focused on climate action at UBC. In addition to their many authored books and journal articles on complexity education, storying systems change, language ecologies, environmental engineering, and energy transition, both individually and collectively, they have also published opinion pieces on complexity and storytelling and transdisciplinary education, given workshops and talks, and consulted with various international groups and stakeholders on environmental education design. They also are the co-founders of the Systems Beings Lab at UBC that promotes a holistic model of systems literacy, an educational intervention and social practice that fosters systems perspectives in a world of increasing complexity. When you meet them, you can just see how brimming with ideas and creativity and passion they are, and it's just absolutely nourishing and catching. So buckle in and enjoy.
Well, hello, welcome. We're here. All right. Hybrid events are, tricky, but we appreciate everyone in Zoom land and that are present here in this room. We're really grateful to be here on this beautiful day. We had a very thorough land acknowledgement for Stefan. Thank you for that. And I think the only thing we'll add is I think a lot of what we're doing in this work, although it's not explicit because of the time, it's very much of a project of decolonizing education and doing it through different kind of alternative epistemological and ontological viewpoints, shifting paradigms, thinking about worldviews in a very different way, particularly non-Western kinds of approaches. So that is a subtext within this, and that's to sort of play on this idea of what land acknowledgements instead of just sort of vocally saying it, but how it plays out in the research and teaching that we do. I think we can. We're trying to make up for a little bit of time so that we don't eat into the next thing. So maybe we'll just kind of move on and not talk about what we're going to do explicitly, and maybe give you a little bit of overview.
Yeah, so as Grace kindly introduced us, we're Naoko and Derek. I'm in engineering. Derek is in environmental education. We do lead a transdisciplinary collaborative PhD program. We work with Metro Vancouver with a cohort of PhD students from diverse disciplines. We also work on many of these climate-related education, and most, I guess, recently have been really working around energy transition from a technical standpoint, from the education standpoint, and what we co-create together. And hopefully that we'll be able to share a little bit of that today, and some systems literacy, complexity that's going to come up.
Yeah, and we admittedly are very interdisciplinary. So today we're trying to kind of hit a number of areas. So it's going to be a bit kind of broader, not expecting everyone to know sort of everything that we're talking about. So, hopefully there's pieces to kind of connect to various people's interests and disciplinary perspectives. And I guess there's kind of maybe if there's a fundamental way in which we're approaching this work, it kind of comes down to a question we've kind of created for ourselves. And that is really everything that we're sort of seeking today is answering this question of how do we cultivate those conditions to hold space for multiple perspectives uncertainty and complexity. And then, of course, with a world of climate change and increasing complications all over the world, polycrises, multi-crises, wicked problems, whichever name we want to come up for these things, they are extraordinarily complex and way beyond typically the kinds of practices that we can engage with them, and using certain kind of mindsets to engage with them. And so we are very interested in exploring these kinds of aspects, even though they're very messy and they're not very clean and not very linear. And we kind of admit that right out of the gate, that this is kind of experimental in many ways.
Yeah, so conditioning the soil for change is something that we actually really talk a lot about with our students and ourselves as well, in terms of how do we grapple with systems change. And I think in the context of this conference today, we are here, and plus the Zoom folks, and really kind of trying to make that soil together. For the next 2 days, we're here to be able to connect, perhaps condition that soil, and we don't know what kind of outcomes or good work that may come out of it, but we hope that we'll be able to connect and share stories and be able to condition that soil for good work. Yeah, one of the things that we talk about with students, and this is academic setting is just fine for this, is that we often look for that tomato plant, or often look for that outcome, specific outcome that we want. And how do we shift that to say, if the conditions of the soil are good, whatever comes out is going to do good. And we've worked with that with students, and been understanding very difficult and challenging to say, okay, we want to be here today for the process to emerge and for things to occur, and not necessarily go to the tomato plant. And that's a metaphor that we use often.
Yeah, and you know, with in order to kind of convert from a monoculture to a complete regenerative sort of culture, it takes about 7 years. And of course, some people say that's literal, and it does take a while, but it's also quite metaphoric in terms of it takes a while. It's not an overnight. It's not a flip on the switch. It's not everything changes immediately. These kinds of changes take time. They're complex. They're not as linear. So these kind of metaphors that we sort of bring in just kind of help almost condition how we approach it cognitively, emotionally, you know, relationally, in thinking about how to sit in process. Process can be very uncertain. Of course, outcomes, we try to create this illusion of certainty and getting somewhere. And of course, we're all very committed to getting somewhere. We want to help and fix things. Sometimes that gets in the way as a strange sort of adverse byproduct of that.
So this is something that we came across.
We've seen this, right? Everyone's good old TikTok going around here.
But in sort of introducing the language of systems, we often think about, yes, what we're facing is dire, is legit. We are really working hard at it. At the same time, zooming in and out. So zooming out to sort of say, where are we at? We're simultaneously here and here, in a sense that it is quite small, and the universe is vast. And sometimes that does help us to grapple with something, many things that we face. Anyway, so we'll kind of go through some of the languages that we might be using around systems. And systems are a set of interconnected nodes or parts that work together to do something. There's a common purpose or a function to these things. And we can see systems. Body is a system. Ecology is a system. There are a number of systems that are overlapping, interconnected, and related that we're looking at.
Yeah, so within this thinking, I mean, we're talking about life here, right? We're trying to sustain life. That's ultimately a big project. And more than human life, particularly, not just human life. So the expanse of what we consider life. And all life is interconnected by systems, right? This is what ecology is all about. These are the kind of studies. And those systems are ultimately regenerative, right? They recreate themselves. There is an incredible amount of creation within those systems, and a high degree of intelligence that's way beyond human understanding. And so sort of what we're kind of dealing with today, and how we're looking at storytelling as an aspect of systemic change, we're really kind of drawing on these principles of ecology and how we see these interconnections and creative potentialities of storying through a kind of regenerative process. And ultimately, you know, we're not going to say hope every turn here, but hopefully we see the metaphor of all this kind of connects to the idea that it is producing a sense of hope, but more in a process way, not in an outcome way. We're not trying to go after hope, but if the conditions are shifted, we're working in systems, then the idea of regeneration does kind of create a sense of hope and potential futuring within that. Yeah, so within these systems, I think something we're very quite keen on decentering a sense of self, decentering a sense of kind of individual identity and working in a relational model, because systems are very relational. We talk about relationality all the time. There's different ways of approaching this. How we see relationality is from a very much of a systems perspective. And if we think of individualism as each one of those nodes have value, and those nodes in and of themselves independently are valued, different sizes we see, different aspects of what we value in those individuals in that kind of structure of society that we've created. When we think in terms of more of a system approach or relationality, it's not about the nodes, it's what happens between the nodes. That's where the meaning is made, is the co-creation. So, you know, individually, we have these ideas, we have these experiences, that's all great. But really, when we start creating meaning is when we connect to two or more of any sort of entity. It doesn't have to be another human, for example. But that aspect of the coordinated action, the created coordinated action, is really what makes those kind of relational encounters within these kinds of frameworks.
Yeah, so these images are from our colleagues, Celiani and Sheila, on design thinking and social construction. Here's an example of having, let's say, waste as the challenge or the problem, and looking at what are the interconnecting nodes. And this kind of thinking allows us to see it from multiple perspectives. And then it might emerge into something that you might see on the right-hand side in terms of how can we kind of shift that in terms of food resource or food share. I think that the way in which we can think in systems allows us to be able to manage what's seemingly a messy problem into different solutions. As an engineer, what I would teach to my students is, okay, here's a big problem. Well, how can we reduce it so that we can kind of think about it linearly? This slide is sort of really talking about linear thinking versus nonlinear thinking. In engineering, we do need to reduce it, because if I'm going to do A, B needs to happen at a predictable way. If I'm going to build a bridge, it needs to stay there, type of thing. And so, you know, students are really engaged in doing that kind of reduced, kind of more contained problem solving. And what I have been teaching is to say, well, yes, and we need to add another dimension, or we need to actually kind of shift a little bit more towards nonlinear thinking, because at the end of the day, it is society, it is the relationships that we have that are going to make a difference.
And to be clear, you know, from kind of systemic standpoint, we don't really sort of work in binaries, right? So it's not like linear is bad, nonlinear is good, right? They both exist in the system. So we're not saying, hey, we should only do nonlinear thinking, as Naoko just alluded to, right? It's all part of the greater kind of complexity. That the problem is when we create a dominant narrative, it's just one of those that is governing everything, right? And that's in our system, of course, linear thinking is very much of a dominant kind of position. We know that. We're very familiar with this. We've been trained in this. This is how we all typically think. I mean, you know, most of us who've gone through Western kinds of forms of educational models. And there's one thing that's kind of helpful, you know, hopeful, generative, whatever kind of, you know, way you want to think about this, is there's an approach called appreciative inquiry. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of appreciative inquiry, right? And this is a really interesting way of applying it. Appreciative inquiry basically says, when you're having challenges, or you're trying to look at an organization, a certain group, you know, any sort of group of gathering, and you kind of want to address some challenges, or you want to think about how you can grow together as a group, right? Rather than focus on the problem and say, okay, what's wrong? Let's go there and let's fix that problem and start from there. It says, don't focus on the problem right now. let's talk about what we do well as a group. Let's kind of bring in some of the aspects and where we really thrive. And so in this kind of model, you know, we could say, well, let's focus on the problem. And then of course, once you're there on the linear thinking, you have causes, you have effects, but it's really kind of rooted on problem thinking. So you really never get out of the problem. You just kind of are still kind of circulating the challenge, right? When you think about nonlinear thinking, you have that possibility of bringing in different kinds of stories. Appreciative inquiry relies a lot on stories in order to build that kind of generative sort of experience within a group. And of course, the problem's there. It's not like the problem disappears, nor are you ignoring it, but suddenly you see it in a larger network, and it's no longer the centerpiece and the focus of everything. It's just part of, you know, how it interrelates and the whole experience. And it as a result, interestingly, it does kind of start to dissolve and work itself out in its own way. So I guess now we're going to try to get everyone in the room a little bit engaged. The hybrid, you know, does make it a little trickier, but we do have a overhead mic and such. So we kind of just want you to take a minute or two, really, turn to somebody next to you, have a bit of a chat, introduce yourself. It's the morning, we're starting the conference, we're trying to be relational, we're all a system here, we're trying to kind of create that embodied sense of feeling. So we just want you to sort of turn to somebody next to you and really chat about what comes up for you when you think about systems in all aspects of your life. What aspects of your life do you really consciously think about systems? Where do they exist? Or if you don't think about it at all, that's okay too, you can say that. And then how might those thoughts relate to climate change? You know, when you think about climate change, how often do you think of it in terms of the interconnections, the different ways that we are influencing everything, and everything's being influenced by everything and so forth. So maybe just take, like, seriously, quite quickly, just a minute or two, just make that happen, and then we'll kind of reconvene.
There's so many different pieces. Some nodes are bigger than others. I think that it ties them all together. Also, learning out of something that requires solution. Same time. Technical solutions engaging in system information and processing to engage just okay.
All right, I know we're kind of short on time, but this is fantastic. What a great story. Would anybody want to share very quickly as to what came up for you?
Or maybe even in a relational sense, share what your partner talked about and what you received and what you listened to. That's the way that you might be able to.
We talked about that idea of making those collaborations between art and science and that idea of linear thinking and the idea of the process of how you're doing something could be that outcome, that product, but it doesn't always appear to be an outcome that's worthy of, significant funding or like that.
Yeah, and online, a few people mentioned about different aspects of the bodies and interdependence and butterfly effect, these kinds of experiences around systems. Oh, yeah, it's great. All right, well, shall we?
Okay. So we talked about us being involved in energy transition. This is a photo I've taken a month ago or so. We were visiting First Nations community there near Fort St. John. It's a photo of Peace River, and those who do know about Site C and how BC needs to electrify, this is the site that is going to be flooded, I guess this month. And it was pretty emotional for me, and it's sort of like talking about, yes, we need to electrify, and BC is blessed in some ways with hydroelectricity, and we are moving forward, but this whole thing, this whole rich landscape that we see here, this river is going to be 2 to 3 times the width. You see a little pathway there, that was a highway, old highway, and the new highway is now set up here. And it's sort of like really struck me as like, there's not a clear, clean solution to say, this is what we're going to do, and there's no consequences to that. I could go on and on, but I sense your thing. So we might sort of talk about it in this context. So here's a Stacy matrix that talks about on the horizontal line, it's talking about certainty. So how close are we to certainty, or how far are we from certainty versus, versus the vertical line, how close are we to agreement, and how far are we to agreement? And in the simple kind of case, once again, it's kind of linear thinking could really be helpful here. A, if I do this, B is going to happen. That's what we need to do. For example, and complicated kind of gets a little bit more complicated. In the slide before, sort of coordinating Site C dam, making all these changes is going to be a complicated task. And then we go into that complex sort of regime where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot that we don't agree. And I'm sure we could all sort of talk about climate emergency, some of the wicked problems all reside here. And that's just kind of the layering that we wanted to bring in to talk about complexity. Anything to add?
Yeah, and just when we, even something as, it seems very simple to make a decision about, Site C dam, like most of us say we shouldn't do it, right? That's a very quick, simple way of looking at it. But as Naoko said, BC is electrifying everything. 97% of our power in BC comes from hydroelectric. There is, as we know, CO2 emissions from hydroelectric is nothing, and that's a good thing. We need lots of that in the world. So suddenly we start getting in these complex realms where actually it's not so simple now, and things aren't such a simple decision. Even though, people are being affected, their homes for millennia is being affected, ecosystems being affected. So we can kind of bounce back all over the place and look at all these different aspects of how this plays out. It's an example. It's not anything that we're making a final judgment on, or we're not asking anyone to. But we could come up with so many of these examples, and that's just sort of a local one. But to sort of exemplify that. Well, we're going to show you a quick video, and we just want you to sort of take it in. What's your impression of this? What comes up for you when you're watching this video, in other words?
Any thoughts?
Tough one.
Yeah,
It's a tough one. Is it good or bad?
Hard to know. Yeah.
Fire?
Fire. Okay.
Oh, I see. Great.
Geothermal, maybe?
Geothermal. Okay.
Yeah.
Hot springs. Hot springs.
Yes. Yes, so,
Anything else? Volcano. Yeah.
excellent. Yeah, so we got to visit this tiny village in Kyushu Island in Japan this summer. And we got there and go, whew, it looks like as if we arrived in hell or something where everything, all the steam was bubbling up and whatnot. And of course, we can talk a lot more during lunch or something. But the gist of it is that there are 23 households that have been there for a number of centuries and utilized the geothermal energy. There's a volcano nearby and they've been utilizing this and surviving. They have a beautiful story of having to have this steam sort of funneled so that there's a communal kitchen. They use that for cooking. And that's not just for cooking, but really to connect and to kind of really kind of take in where they are and how they live. So yes, more stories, but that was something we wanted to share.
And this is kind of the transition of thinking about story and how we think about engaging in that kind of work through systems, right? And so this is, for us, we're looking at this particular place through a concept of energy storytelling, how energy stories emerge and how we think about geothermal. We could look at this and have lots of stories that we're creating in ourselves and watching this. Yes, it could look terrible. It could look great. I mean, when you're there, it's quite intense. It smells like sulfur. Everything's hot. You know, it does feel like the apocalypse, honestly. And yet it's completely, you know, self-sustaining, renewable, regenerative energy talent, right? So these kind of conceptions of what things look like and what we're thought to, you know, led to how they look versus how the stories emerge out of that creates a kind of understanding, get multiple perspectives, all that sort of thing. And so these are, of course, just reminders of how much stories are part of that connective tissue of really the world and how we make sense and create meaning in those kind of co-creative coordinated actions that we talked about through how relational frameworks and systems work.
Yeah, so we're interested in using stories and connecting, not just to connect, but to sort of look at systems change. How does that happen? How do we create that soil to have that start? We might not be able to kind of see it in some ways, but how do we know that we can do that kind of work and let emergence happen, let be what might happen together?
And we do this a lot, right? What's the refrain from a lot of the youth movements? It's not just we want change, we want systems change. We want complete change. We don't just want, you know, one policy shift or, oh, now we have a new bill, we're putting a lot of money into climate funds. We want system change. So what does that mean? And that's really challenging, right? Because many of us, including ourselves, weren't necessarily trained in systems change. We don't, you know, we have to sort of be into this and think about how this might look and what this might work as. And obviously, we're not going to answer that question completely or even slightly today. That's for all of us to do throughout the conference, and we can kind of engage in that and see and reflect on that possibility in the work that we're all doing. Because again, that's a big part about systems changes. For us, you know, we look at it in the context, at least here, of what we're calling storying. You know, some of us are very adept experts in narrative and storying in this room. Some are not. We use, and this is just kind of say, we're not going to get too deep into that side of things, but we'll just say we use storying as kind of an actionable way of thinking about language and meaning that engages things like stories, storytelling, and narrative. and the different ways that couch larger narratives. Narrative gets very complex. Stories can maybe seem more simple. Storytelling, can be many different things, but by using storing as kind of an overarching verb, it also indicates kind of the process-based aspect of storing. It's not product-based, not outcome-based, but it's ongoing. And so that's kind of how we connect this. And then, just really kind of making those links about how storing are parts of systems. And we work in systems all the time, actually. We live in them, we swim in those waters, just like we do storing, right? It's all over the place. So we just kind of pay attention and see again, that metaphor of connective tissues, I think, is really useful. Bodies and how different bodies come together. But yes, there's all those connections in which this happens in terms of interconnectedness, and how, context is very key to complexity. We looked at the Site C Dam example, or even the in Kokonoi and Kyushu in Japan example. We could just kind of go all day long and look at these kinds of ways of how context and complexity matters always, and we can never just say, oh, this works here, so it's going to work here. Everything is different, just like all relationships are different. There's no one similar relationship, right? And then how things emerge and being mindful or observant or curious enough to sit back and watch emergence happen, to listen to emergence, to receive emergence, right? So many talking heads these days in the world. Everyone's got an opinion about everything, right? What would it be like just to watch things emerge a little bit more and make space for that, right? Create those capacities. And then how storing in systems really kind of builds the capacity for multiple perspectives. Again, a real challenging thing for society right now. Make space for, well, there might be lots of paradoxical, contradictory perspectives in the world. And how do we make space for those things? Because they are all part of the systems that we're engaged in. So that's just sort of a quick overview. And so it's one of those moments, right, where you're always like, oh, should we do the activity? Should we not do the activity? It's going to go very simply, and you're going to just be like 1 minute, 2 minutes, and we're going to all come back. No, of course we don't. No, that doesn't happen. But we still kind of want to get you engaged a little bit. So we're a little bit we're in a contradictory state here, but that's good because now we're embodying the very things we're talking about. You can't control this. It's true. There's a high degree of uncertainty right now. So with activating these layered stories, and we were so confident that this is such a great group. We know you're going to do this perfectly and just be very quick about this. But what we want you to do is we want you to very quickly walk around the room and find an object that's calling you. An object, we don't need to get in the object subject. I'm just saying something that's calling you. I'm getting the linguistics here. And when you find that thing, object, experience, whatever it is, feel it, experience it, right? Just see what's coming up for you, what's emerging, and what connects you to this object. Is there anything that connects you to that object? There might even be a story that comes up for you with this connection to the object. If so, just pay attention to it. Watch what it is, make that connection, experience that. So 2 minutes, we can do it, right? 2 minutes. Go.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I'm sat down.
Yeah, I've been trying to decide if it's a.
No, no, it turned out my comment made it. I was like, yeah.
Shades Path a long time ago, I think Amy Harris. Yeah, that's fine. Oh yeah, doing that tomorrow.
It's actually just. How are you?
Oh really? Oh cool. Yeah.
That was what your presentation was. I was trying to remember.
It's not about that. Oh, it might. I probably talked about. I've interviewed someone from there for my PhD, and I'm familiar with narrative anarchy. So there's right. I've been to a bunch of other ones, but I haven't been there. There was a postdoc there first year that I was like, yeah, but they like wanted you to finish your PhD and be ready to go out in August, and I was not that. So maybe next year. It was just another climate museum by Mellon. So it was like looking over there, looking. I was like, I should you do. Yeah, it's such a cool. Like I know I do extra things. Had so technical. This cool thing called I had to answer all of them. And so it's like just down in Seattle listening to my niece and nephew like over the weekend, and they're 8 and 10 now, and then they kind of baby also. Yeah, I was like, they were like, let's have that. I was like, wow, you guys just are like in this soccer school, like the full driving and moving.
Back to our seats.
Yeah, she's process. It was so cool. Yeah. Like there's she's like she's totally. Yeah, that'd be awesome. Is it a research track? I've talked to baby.
Okay, let's break. Let's get back here. Coffee's gonna be soon. We're 10 minutes away from coffee, so we're almost there.
She's also climate as well. She's really old. I'm very she's connected with you.
So again, maybe we'll just have one person share quickly their experience of what came up or what that was like. Yeah, go.
I walked towards that lamp because I've been looking at it all morning and thinking, wow, my grandparents have the same one. And it's so old school, and I remember playing with it as a kid.
This lamp here.
That lamp right there.
Sure, okay, one more. You go ahead. 20 minutes.
And then I remembered myself because my school library had the same architecture for the kind of design of the books laid out, and it's part of the encyclopedia which I used to look at in my childhood. And those were things which I was really interested in. So quite
Yeah, both those stories were actually quite generative, very hopeful in some ways, right? Kind of a state of feeling connected to something, and yeah, so just a simple way of kind of getting outside of, as Ellis, anyway, when she opened up the conference saying, how do we get out of the cognitive? How do we think beyond the intellectual, right? How do we kind of get in our bodies, the affective, different experiences that these things might emerge? So this is kind of a bit of an exercise to connect those affective relational aspects of the storying process and also the systems process. So we do want to have a little bit of time where we can have a bit of a chat. So we're just going to kind of wrap and say if there's sort of some takeaways that we might think about in terms of how we see this work kind of connecting. And really, we do a lot of this work with transdisciplinary graduate students because transdisciplinarity, as we all know, is challenging enough. Because again, it's another way of dealing with complexity. It is, a space that does have a high degree of uncertainty and challenge. So bringing and storing really helps kind of those uncertain conditions of complexity. We might think of them as entangled worlds, the ways in which we cannot separate things very easily, or nor should we. How it teaches, really this idea of how we sit with multiple perspectives and the paradoxical nature of multiple perspectives, and how, paradox in and of itself is a very interesting space to spend time. And then really how it cultivates, the idea of adaptation. How do we change? We talk about systems change. A big part of that is how we adapt. and how we move through those change. The one thing humans hate is change. We know that. This is historically obvious. It's presently obvious, you know, it's challenging. So shifting how we think about adaptation and flowing of those dynamic changes is a big part of this process. And then, yeah, you know, kind of shifting into possibilities of regeneration and how we think about regenerative storying. You know, restoring regenerative futures, as our kind of title suggests, and how that kind of is a maybe invitation for the conference, and how we all are doing this in our own capacities, and how it activates, you know, curiosity. It embraces the idea of not knowing. You know, the slide that we showed with the TikTok, you know, is really much about we don't know much, right? Let's just all kind of admit that. Well, it's hard for us, I know. It's a particularly hard group to admit that we don't know things, but it's true. We actually don't know a lot.
I
Yeah.
think this image needs a little explanation. It is an improv dance, and we do kind of use the improv as well in terms of coming up with many of these things where there's no wrong note. Everything, you know, becomes that because we're so not flexible, not open, not listening. And so improv jazz is a good metaphor as well. And these are some of the things that we do.
Yeah, and this list could go on, but we'll kind of, we'll stop there. And